The week of the 4th of July holiday, my family and I were at Camp Allen in Navasota, and that's the camp and conference center for the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, and I was the chaplain in residence. We woke up to the same terrible news everyone else did on the 4th of July about catastrophic flooding in central Texas along the Guadalupe River. There are at least 129 confirmed deaths. More than that are still missing. At least 19 of those who died were from Houston, some of them known to some of you. In Kirk County, at least 36 children died, most of them from Camp Mystic. I thought about their parents while I was at Camp Allen in a conference center that was completely filled with other parents and their children with disabilities. I thought about them as we drove back to Houston on Sunday, knowing anxious parents were driving to Camp Allen at the same time to drop off their kids for a new session of summer camp. I thought about them on the evening of July 4th, while reading some of the worst comments from strangers on social media. The Texans were getting what we deserved, that those children suffered the consequences of how their parents voted, that it must be sarcastically God's will. I don't know how we will ever get out of the collective pit many of us feel like we're in as a nation, even if we disagree about how we got here, unless we start caring about other people. Who is my neighbor? That's one of the most important questions anyone ever asked Jesus in the pages of the Gospels. There have been lots of different answers given through the centuries. Do you have to be part of the same ethnic tribe to count as a neighbor? The same religious tribe? The same political tribe? The same national tribe? Or do you simply have to be a human being created in God's image, living in this world? We know how Jesus answered that question, even when many Christians today act as if they've never heard his famous response. But other questions linger in the air without an answer. For example, what should we have done if we had come upon the injured person before he ended up in the ditch while he was still being robbed? Should we just stand by piously, praying until they finish beating him? Or should we take our staff in hand and defend him from being physically assaulted? And after the injured man has healed and gone home, is that the end of our responsibilities? Or should we build a hospital by a dangerous road, or a warning siren by a dangerous river to care for others in the future? Perhaps the most difficult question which remains unanswered is why this person ended up in the ditch, left there to die, rather than the rest of us. Many of those parents of flood victims will be wrestling with God over this very question. I'm reminded of an elderly Christian here in Houston during Hurricane Harvey who showed no fear as she was rescued from rising floodwaters inside a nursing home, but concluded her statement to the Washington Post by saying, somewhat ambiguously, God promised he'd never do this again. There are moments that cause doubts about not only God's goodness, but also God's very existence. And those who rush to God's defense often make matters worse with hurtful words of false comfort. At times they dishonor God's holy name more than ecclesiastical outlaws who raise their fists to heaven in moral outrage over the suffering of the innocent. But the truth is that it doesn't take rising floodwaters to float such a question to the surface. Suffering that demands a response can be found all around us all the time. Neglected children live unseen in many communities, including ours. Maybe friends we want to rescue have made decisions that place them beyond our reach. Battles with disease might be taking place within our own bodies. And all of us will face a time when someone we love becomes lost in the shadow of death. Who shall wipe away our tears? David Hart is an Eastern Orthodox theologian with some helpful thoughts about this. He's the author of a book entitled The Doors of the Sea, Where Was God in the Tsunami? Although written as a reflection on the tragic deaths of more than 225,000 people in Southeast Asia at the end of 2004, his reflections are just as important today in the midst of thinking about the flooding in Central Texas or about whatever trials we might be facing ourselves. And surely he is right to suggest that we should all remain silent at first. Acting in generosity as soon as possible is one thing, and without question we ought to stand close to those suffering the experience of Good Friday. But it's almost blasphemous to seek out a greater meaning for it all before weeping with those who mourn. The floodwaters that killed all those adults and all those children whom we'll remember in our prayers today were not divine retribution. And it isn't part of some divine plan, as a few streams of Christian theology might suggest, in which someone's pain is required to show forth the glory of God. We aren't better people because tragedy of one kind or another didn't befall us. And we most certainly aren't better Christians when we stand at a distance and affirm wrongly and overconfidently that everything happens for a reason. Reflecting upon that kind of response in the face of a father who lost 4 of his 5 children in the tsunami, David Hart states the obvious. He writes, "Most of us would have the good sense to be ashamed to speak such words, and this should tell us something. For if we would think it shamefully foolish and cruel to say such things in the moment when another's sorrow is most real and irresistibly painful, then we ought never to say them." In the middle of the Nicene Creed, we speak of the crucifixion of Jesus, anchoring our faith not only in the pages of history, but also in every experience of God-forsakenness. It brings us, the people of God, into the suffering of the world where God has led the way. In one of his less familiar stories, J.R.R. Tolkien retells the beginning of all things in creation. And he includes a helpful image about the relationship between divine providence and the chaos we encounter loose throughout the world, whether we're looking at images of destruction from the flooding or just the hidden messes in our own lives. In the literary imagination of Tolkien, God is represented by Eru, also known as Iluvatar. And Iluvatar first created the Ainur, the holy ones, who are like the hosts of heaven. Iluvatar taught them about music and was very pleased as they began to sing. The more they listened to each other, the more they began understanding one another and singing in harmony. Iluvatar then spoke to them about a great theme that would bring forth great music, and so it did. This music spilled out into the void, making it no longer a void. But one of the Ainur, who had spent too much time alone in the void places before the music, wanted to increase the importance of his own part. And these thoughts became part of his music, disrupting the harmony surrounding Iluvatar. As Tolkien describes it, the melodies foundered in a sea of turbulent sound, a raging storm as of dark waters that made war one upon another in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. And this is where Tolkien provides a helpful image for us. Iluvatar arose, smiled, and lifted up his left hand. A new theme with its own beauty evolved in the midst of the storm, but the discord grew more violent than before. So Iluvatar arose with a stern countenance and lifted up his right hand. Yet another theme arose above the confusion. The music without harmony could not overtake the other. In fact, in the words of Tolkien, its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. But the strife continued, rippling out into the silences that had never been disturbed. For a third time, Iluvatar arose, and his face was terrible to behold. Iluvatar raised up both hands. He brought forth a single chord deeper than the abyss and higher than the firmament. And suddenly, the music came to an end. Iluvatar explained that it was impossible to destroy the music. Anyone who attempted to do so would become another instrument in creating things yet more wonderful. Finally, Iluvatar took the Ainur into the void and said, "Behold your music." And before them appeared a new world. Now, for me, that's a helpful way to think about not only the world as it is, but also the new creation that awaits us. In Tolkien's story, God is not the source of discord, the chaos in the worlds around us and within us. And God is not pleased with such freedom abused. Yet God is able to create anew, bringing good out of evil, bringing the chaos to an end. For those who prefer less indirect speech about such weighty matters, I turn again to the words of David Hart, because his final thought leaves nothing more to be said. He wrote, "God will not unite all of history's many strands in one great synthesis, but will judge much of history false and damnable. He will not simply reveal the sublime logic of fallen nature, but will strike off the fetters in which creation languishes. And rather than showing us how the tears of a small girl suffering in the dark were necessary for the building of the kingdom, he will instead raise her up and wipe away all tears from her eyes. And there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, nor any more pain, for the former things will have passed away. And he that sits upon the throne will say, 'Behold, I make all things new.'" Amen.